Hello, it's me, back for my yearly video. Before I jump into this one, it's worth mentioning that this is not a tutorial, it's more of a record of what I did with the pattern and how I created what I made out of it. Footage is also a little bit patchy as I literally had time to finish the costume, get changed, get to the venue I was making it for, and arrive with 4 minutes to spare. So there was a certain point where I decided that wasn't actually enough time to set up all of the camera things and take footage. The footage that I have is mostly from the neck corset from Simplicity 8363. However, I think it is worth mentioning the other parts of the costume and how I deviated from the patterns as written. I'll work top down, so first up is the neck corset. Right off the bat, I wanted to make the shoulders a little bit more forgiving than the pattern allowed. You can see that I've drawn a line of chalk that's tapering down to the wrist and joining the pattern as written. And in all honesty, I probably should have given myself a little bit of extra room. This pattern is made for people who have quite thin arms without very much meat or muscle, which is fine, it's just not how I'm built. Cutting the pattern was relatively straightforward, as was sewing it. One thing I did decide to do for this was French seams, which I thought was neater than just the raw seams. I did actually buy an overlooker which I intended to use for this project, but I had a terrible time threading it, and due to time constraints I decided that it wasn't really worth figuring out how to do that for this particular project. As I mentioned, French seams are quite neat compared with the raw seams, and also quite robust. But they are just a little bit more complicated to think about in terms of sewing the parts together, and there was one sleeve that I had to unpick and redo due to sewing it on the wrong way. Another thing that I changed about this pattern was the way that the rivets were secured onto the back. To tell the truth, I'm a lot more familiar with how leatherworking works, and so I just kind of modified the pattern to slip a little bit of leather in to the back of the corsetry. I am absolutely certain that there are other accepted ways of doing this. These were just the tools that I had on hand and the skills that I was most comfortable with. Probably the most glaring issue with this pattern is that the corsetry ties for getting it on and off are actually at the back of the neck, which realistically nobody's really going to want to loosen those enough to get their head in and out of every time they take it off and put it on again. It's simply not really comfortable or possible without a second person involved. I added a zip to the front, which makes life so much easier. It was a bit of a last minute addition since this was the last costume piece that I made, and it would look so much sleeker with a hidden zip, but that wasn't what I had on hand at the time. I went a bit wild with the presets on my sewing machine and used this stitch to add a bit more of a forest fay flair. It's a bit more exciting than a straight line and a little bit more forgiving too, considering that I was in a bit of a rush. Because my character needed wings, my final two additions to this pattern were a couple of loops attached using leather to the inside of the back. This absolutely isn't necessary if wings are not part of the plan, nor is it really particularly recommended. However, for this particular rendition of the costume, wings were very much part of the plan. This part is entirely my own design. One of the essentials that was needed for this costume were a pair of wings, and I went into it with a very strong idea of what I did want and what I didn't want for them. I did want something with a wow factor that could look like wings, and that would fit with the kind of flowy, fey look that I was imagining in my head. It had to naturally attach to the costume and preferably detach too, so that I had a bit of an option if I wanted to change from the neck corset in the future. I wouldn't need to redo anything other than the attachments. I didn't want something that would get in the way or maybe catch in doorways or whack people, or cause a hazard if I was running or dramatically dying or doing a flourish in a sword fight or anything like that. After some brainstorming with a friend, I decided that I wanted these to be in 2 layers and pleated to gently evoke the sense of mushroom spores with a very floaty sense. They were one of the first pieces I made for the costume. They were very, very simple. They fall quite a lot like a cloak when they're not in use, and when they are in use, they flare extremely dramatically and flap as I run. Like the wings, I have absolutely no footage of the creation part of the corset. It was actually a lot easier than I expected to make for the first corset that I've ever made. Like the neck corset, I inserted leather in behind the rivets. although a softer leather to allow for a little bit more flexibility. I decided to forego the boning, and this, plus the fact I think it's made for somebody with a little bit more chest than I have, means that it is a little bit prone to slipping. I had planned to wear something underneath, and I found that safety pins worked quite effectively, but this is definitely something to bear in mind for this pattern. These were the first part of the costume that I made. I was originally planning to overlock the seams down the leg instead of leaving them raw, but after an evening fight with the overlocker I decided that I would rather just leave them raw before time issues, as mentioned previously. I did manage to get the overlocker threaded eventually, and it turned out to be so much easier than it had felt on that first day. I used it quite a lot when I was making this shirt. I used the Simplicity 8885 pattern for these pants, and they were really straightforward to make. My only comment would be to watch the room left for the backside, as they're quite tight, but I think it's in a fairly flattering way, so that's okay. So this is how all the pieces look together. I might one day sew wider sleeves, although it might be alright if my arms don't get bigger. My only other addition would be a nice little mushroom hat, like the kind that went crazy on social media not so long ago. It would need to be big enough to work as a functional hat, and aesthetic of course, while being light enough that I can run and move fast in it. That one is probably a bit more of a priority for the next game, since it will be in summer. That's all from me. I'll be back next year, probably. Take care. Bye. A little bit magic.